Hello and welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes and sharing practical tips to bridge that generation gap. Today I'm joined by Shelley Bridgman. Now Shelley is a speaker, transformational coach and author. She's been a media commentator specialising in psychotherapy, psychology and coaching, with appearances on BBC TV, Sky News, Channel 4, Channel 5 as well as Radio 4's Woman's Hour. She's also been on Midweek, The Jeremy Vine Show, that must have been a high, on Radio 2, and she's also featured in Psychologies and Therapy Today magazines. And we were talking just before we got started about Shelley's comedy career as well, but we'll come to that if we have time later. Shelley, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
Now, we're going to start off, as I do with every one of my guests, talking about your generation and whether you feel that you are stereotypical of your generation. You are a boomer, and boomers are seen as maybe not being very tech savvy, not being up to date with things, and being dragged and kicking into the 21st century. Does that sound like you? And what other things would you say that you do or don't conform to the stereotype of a boomer?
One of the things I have in common with Generation Z is I hate stereotypes. And I find that a lot when I work with young people. So, no, I don't believe I am typical. There are certain traits that I've got where I am that I can't deny. I embrace media. I don't have a problem with, I do have a problem with technology sometimes, like everybody else, but I use it. I'm not scared of it. And I think because I still work and I work with young people, it's enabled me to just keep rolling, really, and pick up on what's going on. If people want to say things like, I don't want to embrace AI, I hate being online, well, fine, but get a different job. You'll get a life. I mean, it's there. It's here. How we use it is the question. So I don't believe I'm typical. I'm not sitting on a pile of money because I was advantaged and have 4 houses and it was easy for me. No, it's no easier for me than it is for people now. It's just different.
I think that's a really interesting distinction to make, isn't it? There's, you have people older people demonizing the young, saying they're entitled and all those things in terms of stereotypes. And you have the young who think, as you suggested there, that if you're a boomer, you're rich, you're wealthy because you were able to do things that they can't do today. And and they're just very unhelpful, those kind of things, aren't they?
I think they am. I had a humble beginning on a council estate. I was no better off or worse off than the people up the road. So we didn't feel deprived. It was just the way it was. And of course, getting on to a different sort of period, 10, 20, 30 years later, yes, we were able to buy houses, put our deposits down. Not everybody did. And a lot of boomers are still saddled with debt, as well as being able to get on the housing ladder. I know that's one of the stereotypes often bandied about. I think it's just different. I think every generation has got its advantages and it's got its downsides. It's how we work with them. That's the key.
But today, younger generations today, of course, are that much more aware of what everybody else around them is doing, where maybe, for boomers, you weren't as aware of everybody else.
No, I mean, you got your news from buying a newspaper and then latterly seeing it on television. I think it's gone full circle, and the young generation now, Generation Z, have got too much information. They're swamped by it. So the challenge is where do they get it from? Where do they pick it from? How do they know it's accurate? How do they recognize the biases? So it's a very different challenge. They're much the same in some ways, that you have to make an effort to get the right information. So that bit we have in common.
Yeah, that is becoming increasingly hard, isn't it? Trying to get unbiased information and taking that effort to go to different news sources to get a different balance of opinion. You work, as you said, with young people, as a therapist. And you obviously are able to connect with younger people. They trust you because they're opening up and talking to you. What do you think you do that maybe other people who struggle to get on with younger generations, what do you think you're doing that's different?
Listen, I mean, that's the biggest thing for anybody, really. But it's really important that don't sort of say, oh, you're that generation, so you will want A, you will want B. But it's about trying to understand, and seeking to understand them. Only one of the traits, I think, is that they will call out BS. They would they'll forgive you for getting something wrong if you admit it or you don't make assumptions. And I think that's one of the things that I like about working with young people. I'm generalizing, of course, because everybody's different. But I think it's that they prioritize emotional intelligence, I think. They're not looking for everybody else to tell them what to do. On the downside, they can get drawn away. They can go down rabbit holes with threads and so on. But I think they push me to sort of look at traditional norms and structures and say, well, actually, I don't know why you said that. I don't feel that. And that's okay.
But the difference is you're listening to that and you're taking it on board, where other people of your generation would maybe become defensive or start arguing, or and then all of a sudden you don't have that open conversation.
I met somebody not long ago who I know to be a year younger than me, and I was staggered by something he said. He said, "Oh, I don't do emails. I don't like technology." Well, I mean, it's more accurate than the post office. You want to get a message to somebody, send an email. A, you can find out if it's got there. And B, it's more likely to get there. I mean, that's just. I felt quite sad actually, because I thought you are excluding yourself. It's not difficult.
I think one of the things that I'm always fascinated by people who it's almost like they've got to a stage in their life when, right, I'm not going to progress any further. Because the reality is when they were young, they were clearly absorbing new technologies, new ideas, new things that were going on around them. And I'm fascinated. At which point does someone who is older suddenly decide, no, that's it. I'm going to cover the world in aspic and I'm not going to go any further. We're going to stop here and now.
I think the danger is for everybody, however old you are, is to get stuck in a time warp. People classically do it with clothes, don't they? They carry on at the age of 40, 50, 60, wearing the type of clothes that they were wearing when they were 19. And I think whether it's clinging on to the past or not, I've never quite, thought it through. But there is a familiarity that we want to keep, I think. And
how does that work in your when you do your transformational coaching? Because clearly you are getting people to think differently when you're doing that. So where do your communication skills dealing with people, especially if they're of different generations, that you're having to do something a little bit differently then, aren't you?
I'm having to check, first of all, that I'm understanding what they mean and not making an assumption. So I'll be frequently saying something like, just so that I make sure I'm clear, do you mean A, B, X? Because otherwise it's very easy to sort of go diving down the wrong rabbit hole and get lost. I mean, we should all do that anyway, really, if you think about it. But I suppose because I'm very conscious of trying to stay connected when I'm talking to an 18-year-old, I'm more aware of it, I think, about giving them that respect. And also, I don't want to get it wrong. I may be hearing something that is inside or outside of my experience and trying to assume that I know it. Biggest thing I've found is I don't think anybody minds if you say, I don't know that I really understood that. Can I just check? Did you mean that? Or did you mean this? Rather than guessing it. And I find they're very unforgiving about making assumptions. It's not a criticism, it's an observation.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree with you. I'd absolutely agree with you. But do you see that clearly it's listening, it's getting that clarity that you talked about, but then what about the actual communication when you're talking to them? How do you change? Because you're working not just with young people, you're also working with people in the corporate world who are looking for their purpose. How does your communication change between the different age groups?
I probably think about it a little less for somebody who's a little older. But then again, I suppose because of the type of work that I do, I like to think that I never assume that I'm fully understanding what somebody says anyway. But I think my antenna's out a bit more when I'm talking to a much younger person. I'll give you an example. We talk about inclusivity is the big thing at the minute, isn't it? It's being abolished, apparently, in some places in the world. I'm looking west. But
we'll gloss over the date we recorded this, but I think everyone will be able to work it out now.
I know that the young, if I'm talking to an 18 or 19-year-old, they see identity as much more fluid than my generation ever did. And I don't mean with gender as exclusively, but with everything. Self-expression, they want to, they will be okay with whatever it is somebody's coming up with. They don't really care whether somebody's sexuality is hetero, gay, bi. No, they're not interested. They don't see colour as my generation does, because they've grown up in a world where their next door neighbour may be brown, black, white, red, yellow. It becomes something that they understand will change all the time, and it doesn't bother them. They don't have conversations about the number of people coming into the country, isn't it terrible? But some do. What I've noticed as well, and I tend not to speak with them, but I know that my generation, for example, the boomers who grew up with CND and the threat of nuclear war, were very left-wing. So if on a campus in America or in Britain, everyone would have been, young communists or socialists, because they didn't want to be like their parents, who were very conservative. And it's gone full circle. A lot of people have got quite right-wing views now. So one of the biggest mistakes, and I made it once with somebody, although the results weren't catastrophic, was making an assumption about their political leaning. And it was totally not what I expected from the way they were talking. Because they don't see being right as evil, as my generation did. And of course, my parents, who were the pre-boomers, had gone through a war, saw this left stuff as a real threat. My mother was appalled when she discovered I'd gone on a CND march.
But how do you deal with this thing that, on one hand, you're quite right, that it's a lot more fluid. There isn't that same binary, it's this or it's that. But at the same time as we have that, politically, and in many people's minds, we've actually become more binary. We're so entitled to our own opinion that we are so right because it's been reinforced by the algorithms on social media. So it to me seems this sort of rather strange paradox that you've got a young generation who generally see things very not in little pigeonholes, but we're also a very divided world.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people often say to me is they'll say, it'd be nice if somebody took some action instead of just talking about it. That's a typical expression I'll get from somebody who's 19 if we start talking about politics or whatever. was talking to somebody who's quite angry that certain news channels can call themselves news channels when they're news magazines, when it's opinion and it's not news. And that, as we know, is common now. They don't officially say, here's a flag, we're left, we're right, whatever. But they are, it's propaganda very often. It's not actual news. I think the one thing all of us struggle with is to discern the difference. I don't think that's exclusive to any age group. It's so easy to put false information out. And what was the expression that became part of the general parlance? Fake news. So use that expression when it suits you.
Yeah.
Fake news, that's not really news. And then when you want it, you don't have to.
But it's the level of conviction that people have, and I'll be interested to see your take whether that's generational or not. But the conviction that people have about an opinion that they have because they have been fed things that perpetuate their own views. Do you think that's a generational thing, or is that something that we're all experiencing?
I think the danger is for as we get older, we all have sort of models of the world, don't we? And in my day, one of the things I hate before elections is when somebody says, "Oh, I've always voted X." It's like, don't you ever think about it? Don't you ever challenge it? And I mean, whether that's a 19-year-old, certainly we're not going to say I've always voted X. I haven't voted yet, probably. But I've always believed this. And that's one of the things that the advantage the young have got, because they're exploring the world and they're not fixed. They don't believe that it's always going to be a certain way. What I do like about the people I speak to a lot of the Generation Z bracket, if you like, is to them, most people I speak to, social justice is a sort of non-negotiable. It's quite unusual to find a very young person who doesn't think that that's something that should just be a given. Shouldn't really be fighting for that. I don't care about your sexuality, but I do care what you do. I do care about what you're doing. What's the difference you're trying to make?
How does that manifest itself in terms of relationships between parent and child? You're working with corporates, so you're seeing them, but you're also working with a lot of youngsters as well. Yeah. So how are you seeing the difference in people's relationships that they have with their children that we maybe had with our parents and so on?
Well, one of the biggest things, of course, is that for me and for you and for a lot of people listening to this, we didn't grow up with technology. Anyone who's born in the last 20 years has grown up with social media. They've grown up with the internet. They've grown up with access to information. It's just there. So I think that's one of the things that, they like shortcuts. They like a meme or something that tells them what it's about. People listening to this saying, "What's a meme?" But but I think for anyone who's got children, as I have, and my children are not Generation Z, they're older. All young people challenge us, don't they? The first time my eldest daughter said to me, "What was it like back in the olden days?" 100 years old. So we all think that the older generation is a sort of dinosaur type of generation. So I think.
Do you think Gen Z today have that same level of seeing old people as dinosaurs as we did when we were their age?
Well, they would never admit it. They probably do, or at least they will probably want to check, because they're going to challenge what we do. If you try and take, I think one of the things that, I'm digressing slightly, but I think it's relevant. One of the things that we still don't know the long-term effects of with the lockdown, because we had follow the science. Nobody ever said follow the psychology. So we knew what to do to keep people physically safe, And we can start arguing about vaccinations and whether lockdown was just to protect the NHS or it was really about people. But the problem is there's a generation of people that lived on a device. You couldn't really, would have been criminal to stop them, because young people who were going to school were suddenly only able to communicate with their friends through this thing that we call a smartphone. And now we wonder why you go to a cafe and people are sitting there talking to each other, but actually they're all looking at a screen. Is it anyone?
But every generation is doing that. You know, we have this stereotype that it's young people doing it, but older people catch up. In our research that I did with Generationally Speaking in 2024, and we looked at people's attitudes, it almost feels like, yes, the young, which by the way, they aren't always the first adopters. You know, older generations are often first adopters as well. But what the difference was is they just will be doing the things that we accuse the young of doing today, we'll probably be doing tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And none of us know, of course, what will actually happen. But I think the other thing that when I knew you were going to be asking me some of these questions, I was thinking one of the things that I know they really like is transparency. They don't like hiding stuff and sort of trying to kid them into something. I'd rather you said, look, we're in a mess, than pretended that we're not. And I think the young people I know who are political, not all of them are, a lot don't care at all. I think that goes across all generations, really. But nothing makes them angrier when they know somebody is hiding something. Makes me angry too. And I'm an older person, but I would say that's very prevalent.
Young people seem to be more involved in movements rather than politics. Again, that's where it's not that direct label of I'm that political persuasion, I'm that political persuasion.
Yeah,
it's more
it's
a movement.
Justice, it's, that's the interest. Things like global warming and green issues, they get very engaged and get really angry when they hear somebody saying, well, we're doing what we can, but we've just shifted the date back by 10 years, or we've just abolished it in some cases. And they're really cross about that, because they say, we're going to inherit this ball that's spinning through space from you. How dare you suddenly tell me you care about me? And I'm watching bits of the polar ice cap fall off, and you're now delaying the moratorium, or you're pulling out of the Paris Accord, or whatever you're doing. That makes them very cross.
What do you do about older people when you have your clients that you work, because you're working with corporate leaders and you're helping them change, and some of them, this might come as a bit of an uncomfortable realization that they've actually been doing things wrong. They're stuck in their own ways, and that they need to be, they need to have a less blinkered view on life. How do you broach that subject when you recognize, working with younger people, that actually what older people sometimes need to do is to think differently? How do you approach that when it comes to communicating it?
I think it's back to what we started with almost, really. It's about seeking to understand, and not, the old idea of marketing and selling was that you put a poster up, didn't you, next to the M4 or the M40 or wherever you live. Now you can target who you're trying to speak to. So you don't have to make mass assumptions and treat people like cannon fodder. X is good for you. Well, it probably isn't. So I think it's really about just saying, well, I'm going to admit that I don't know, and I'm not going to patronize them by just assuming that I know what's best. I'm going to do my research. I'm going to find out what they want. When I employ somebody, I have a right to expect what I want from them. Maybe I should say, do you think it's important in your workplace, if you came and worked for us? What would you bring, but what would you want as well? What would help you?
I'm guessing people who work with you, they're open to these suggestions because by virtue of the fact they're coming to you. But if they're resistant to it,
Always
because so how do you deal with that resistance?
find out what it's about. I mean, it's quite simple. In the end, it's like, okay, so tell me a bit more about that. Then. What didn't you like about that? I want to ask you about it. I don't want to talk about that. Okay, well, I won't push you, but you mind telling me what it is that you're worried about? Not why.
Yeah, it's all about how you ask the question.
Yeah.
I want to talk very briefly before we wrap up with some tips and some final bits of advice. I want to talk about your comedy because you have done improv, you've done all sorts of comedy.
We're very
and
today. We haven't very, very serious,
I know,
isn't it?
we're moving slightly away from our core topic, but humour is something that, do we consider it being generational, or is humour?
Oh, God, that's such a good question. I don't know that I actually have the answer for that. I think it's got to be generational to a point. But then is it more about the subject that it has to be adapted? I would say it's probably more that, you know, a gag is a gag. You can laugh at one of the comics I like, Tim Vine, who does the puns. You can be 16 and he can be funny. You can be 86 and he can be funny. But of course, what comics do is they speak to their audience. So if you're talking to a young person, then you know that certain things are winding them up. So you'll be in touch with that culture. So I suppose the idea is, again, it's about adapting your material to the audience. But that applies to all generations, I think.
And I think we can learn a lot from comedy in terms of connecting with each other, because of course with comedy, as you and I both know, if you don't connect with your audience in comedy, it's a very short-lived career.
Well, it is, and one of the things I learned, because I worked in the USA for a while doing comedy, is that they're very visual. They like visual stuff, so you'll find that the comics are quite animated. They're quite loud. They're building a picture. We're a bit drier, and we do throwaway lines and a bit more understated, and that's harder for them. But I think that's more about culture than generation, really.
And that's something that is a whole different topic, isn't it? Because you've got, on one hand, you've got generations. And again, I use this model of the 5 circles of generational influence. Right. What makes you, you? And the first one underneath your generation is, well, where are you culturally? Because if you're from the USA, you had a very, if you look at lockdown, for example, the impact of lockdown for you, if you were in Sweden, which was the most relaxed, to say someone like parts of the US, which were not the parts of the US, parts like Australia and New Zealand, which were incredibly strict, you had a totally different experience. But I think we're going to have to talk about that one another time. Just to wrap up today, could you maybe just share, given your experience as a psychotherapist and a purpose and legacy coach, give us a couple of your tips of what you think are better ways to bridge that communication gap between generations?
Well, I think one of the things is they tend to value inclusivity, mental health, transparency. We talked about those. I think the upbringing, we have to recognise that they've grown up in a technological age with information. They get information overload. So don't give them more. Don't just chuck stuff at them. Find out, ask a bit more than you would normally what they want, I think would be a good tip for me. Because they don't just want to be told, well, the meaning of X is so-and-so. They don't find that in 5 seconds flat. You don't need that. But being seen, I think, They don't want to be cancelled. You know that word, cancel culture.
Yeah.
They might want to cancel somebody else, but they don't want to be cancelled. Views on identity,
Shelley,
they challenge a lot because they're, like I said, they're more fluid, and social justice and so on. I think for me, they're the biggest things.
Shelley, it's been a fantastic conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've learned a huge amount, as well as I know our audience will have done as well. If people want to get hold of you, if they would like to find out more about your work and what you do, where can they find you?
At ShelleyBridgman.com is the easiest place. You can email me via that, or I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn mainly. So.
And we'll put those links at the bottom in the show notes.
Me with LinkedIn, and I'd love to have a conversation. Yeah.
Shelley, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you everybody else as well. You can find out more at Alastair Greener, Generationally Speaking, on our podcasts, and you'll find all of that information at generationnallyspeaking.co.uk. Thanks for joining us. See you next time. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationnallyspeaking.co.uk.